At the edge of the death zone, on the upper slopes of K2, an American expedition was preparing to push for the summit when one of their team members collapsed in the snow. Art Gilkey, a 26-year-old geologist and graduate student from Boulder, Colorado, had developed a deadly blood clot in his leg. The heroic rescue effort that followed would culminate in a dramatic accident when the entire team would begin falling down a cliff of solid ice. It would come down to one man, the 26-year-old Pete Schoening, to single-handedly save his 6 teammates from plummeting 2 vertical miles down to the glaciers below. Here is the story of how it happened. It was 1953, and a small American team led by Dr. Charles Houston had finally returned to K2 after a failed attempt 15 years earlier. The team consisted of only 8 climbers, which ruled out the use of supplemental oxygen, as there was not enough manpower to carry the extra weight up the mountain. Despite persistent storms hammering the climbers with snow and wind, the team persevered and established a camp at 7,800 meters. This was thanks in large part to the daring efforts of both Gilkey and Schoening, who cut steps into a massive ice cliff where the legendary fall would later unfold. With the summit in sight, the team planned to make one final camp at the foot of the infamous bottleneck, from which they would send 2 summit teams. The first team would consist of George Bell and Robert Craig, while the second, should the first team fail, would consist of Gilkey and Schoening. Unfortunately, these plans were never carried out. That night, monsoon winds began to blast their tents and continued for several days. The tent shared by Charles Houston and George Bell was shredded, forcing the pair to crawl into the 2 remaining tents with their teammates. The climbers were also becoming dehydrated, as they could not keep their stoves lit to melt snow for drinking water. Finally, nearly 4.5 days later, as the team ate breakfast, there was a break in the storm. Morale lifted, and they turned their focus back to the summit. Unfortunately, their optimism would be short-lived. As he stepped out of his tent just 10 minutes after their breakfast, Art Gilkey collapsed in the snow. Pain from the blood clot in his leg, which he originally passed off as a cramp, had now caused him to faint. Dr. Houston and the others were shocked that Gilkey, who had appeared to be in such excellent condition that he was placed on a summit team, had developed thrombophlebitis, a condition that had never been heard of happening on a mountain. As Robert Bates would later write, smallpox would have been no more surprising to us. Gilkey's condition was critical, and almost certainly fatal if he remained at their current altitude just 200 meters below the death zone. Immediately, the American team abandoned their push for the summit and mounted a desperate attempt to get Art Gilkey down the mountain. But the storm quickly returned, and the team had no choice but to stay at their camp for another 3 days. Finally, on the night of the 3rd day, a piece of Gilkey's clot broke off and entered his lungs. Dr. Houston decided that they must descend in the storm, or Gilkey would die. Bates would capture the sentiment of the team when he wrote, "The venture seemed absolutely desperate, but we would have done anything for Art Gilkey as he would have done for us." They used the torn tent to lash his sleeping bag, tied it with ropes, and began one of the most legendary rescue attempts in mountaineering history. In order to retreat to their lower camps, the Americans would need to contend with the ice cliff that Gilkey and Schoening had cut steps into nearly 2 weeks prior. Descending the steps with Gilkey in the sleeping bag would be impossible, so the team would need to circle around the cliff and traverse the perilously exposed ice slope beneath it. Any fall from this position would end 2 miles down on the glaciers below. Robert Craig was the first to cross, having just barely survived a powder snow avalanche that nearly swept him and Gilkey off the mountain. As the others followed, catastrophe struck. George Bell fell suddenly. His rope mate, Tony Streether, was yanked along with him and fell into the rope connecting Houston and Bates. Houston was pulled down the mountain, and Bates watched helplessly as he vanished into the storm. Bates desperately thrust his axe against the ice to arrest their fall, but the ice was too hard. The rope went taut, and Bates was violently ripped backwards by the weight of his teammates. Tony Streether then became tangled in another rope connecting D. Molinar and Gilkey, causing Molinar to fall. At this point, apart from Craig, who was out of reach at their camp, and Gilkey, who was incapacitated in his sleeping bag, the only climber on the team not falling down K2 was Pete Schoening. Schoening was roped to Gilkey, and as the others fell, the weight of 5 climbers, Streether, Molinar, Bates, Houston, and Bell, fell on Gilkey and was transferred to Schoening. Through the storm, Schoening saw movement and realized that somebody had slipped. The rope connected to Gilkey was wrapped around his axe and his hips, with the axe planted firmly behind a boulder. Schoening held onto the rope in his right hand and leaned into the top of the ice axe to keep it fixed behind the boulder. Through sheer strength and skill, he held them all. After the fall, the climbers were in disarray. Houston in particular was badly dazed with a concussion and would require continuous care throughout the following night. Unfortunately, tragedy would strike again. After the team finished their traverse to their camp, they left Art Gilkey roped in an ice gully while they set up their tents. When they returned, they would find only a bare slope. As they had assembled the tents, an avalanche had swept down the gully, carrying Gilkey away. The Americans had little time to mourn his loss before turning back to their own desperate situation. Thankfully, Charles Houston made a remarkable recovery from his head injury, and all of the remaining climbers would survive the descent to base camp. There, the team created a memorial for Art Gilkey, where it remains today, and it has since become a burial place for many other climbers who have died on K2. The 1953 American expedition has since become legendary for the courage shown by the climbers in their attempt to save Art Gilkey. Pete Schoening's save on the ice slope would also go down in history, known simply as the Belay. Robert Bates would later write of Schoening's miraculous feat, "It couldn't happen, but it did." Schoening himself remained modest, claiming that he was merely lucky.